I remember the exact moment the sky broke, because everything before it feels like someone else's life, and everything after it has been one long, dragging second that refuses to end. I was on the loading platform of Habstack G12, hands numb from 12 hours moving munition crates for a war I'd only ever seen as flashes on a distant picked feed, when the daylight turned the wrong color, a thin, metallic violet that made everyone on the deck stop at the same time, like we'd all heard a voice that hadn't spoken yet, and then the sirens started. Not the usual shift change wails or the distant manufacturing alarms, but the deep-bellied roar of the city's void shield warnings. A sound you're told exists but never expect to hear. The kind of sound that makes your bones remember that you are, in fact, very, very mortal. People around me dropped what they were doing. Crates thudding to the rockreet, one of the overseers shouting for order. But his voice got swallowed by that howl and by the whisper that came after. The quiet hiss of a billion vox relays flickering to life and then dying all at once, a strangled, half-formed message crackling overhead. All citizens remain. By order of the Emperor protects, before cutting out in a fuzz of static that smelled like burnt copper, and made the hairs on my arms stand up through the dust. I looked up then, finally, past the cranes and the gantries and the forest of landing pylons, and saw the void shield dome for the first time, a faint shimmer high above the hive's jagged skyline, like heat over metal, except it was dimming, flickering. Patches of it going thin and transparent as something hammered at it from above. Bright, white-orange impacts blooming across it like sores on skin. And every time one glowed I felt a pressure in my chest, like the air had been punched out of the world itself. Someone next to me started praying, low and fast. Half-remembered litanies to the Emperor, fingers tapping a makeshift aquila against his breast, and I wanted to tell him to shut up, because we weren't supposed to say that out loud during work shifts. The overseers frowned on faith that wasn't sanctioned and scheduled, but the words died in my throat as the first piece of the sky actually fell. It wasn't sky, obviously. It was something burning up in Atmo, a ship, a station, maybe just a defense platform that had once been the reason we slept so easy. But from ground level it looked like a chunk of heaven ripping loose, screaming as it came down, trailing a tail of fire that painted every hab wall in trembling orange. And then the impact came a heartbeat later, somewhere beyond the horizon. A concussion that rolled up through the hive foundations and made every beam, every cable, every breath vibrate. Dust sifting down from the superstructure in lazy curtains that glittered in the emergency lights. Some people screamed, some dropped to their knees, some just stood there blank-eyed, and I realized, in that dead pause between shock and panic, that no one was giving orders anymore. The overseer who'd been barking at us for stacking crates too slowly was gone, vanished into the stampede as workers searched for the stairwells, the lifts, anywhere that wasn't here, and the only sound besides their boots and the distant thunder was the clatter of a Medicaid servitor's tray as it was knocked aside and skittered across the deck, like a coin tossed by a bored god. I should have run with them, I guess, but my legs didn't get the message. I walked instead, not because I was calm, but because there's a kind of terror that moves too fast to show on your face. That turns every step into something weirdly precise. Like if you put your foot in the wrong place, the whole world will admit it's already over. I made it to the edge of the loading platform and looked down through the gaps in the railing, all the way into the mid-level streets below, a canyon of hab blocks and transport rails, and people, so many people, boiling through the arteries of the city, like blood trying to escape a wound, and that was when the second wave hit. The sky flared white, so bright it erased color for a heartbeat. The void shield screamed, I swear I heard it, not a sound, but as a sensation like your teeth grinding together, and then something punched through, a spear of incandescent light stabbing down into the far side of the hive, followed by another, and another, until the horizon looked like someone was hammering nails into reality, each one driving a shockwave through the air that made my lungs stutter. I didn't know if it was an orbital bombardment from some xenos fleet or a renegade cruiser, or some catastrophic failure of our own defenses, and to be honest, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that Everything I'd ever thought of as background, the hap stacks. The manufacturer, the endless, comforting sameness of Imperial industry, was now something that could be taken away in a single breath. Someone grabbed my arm then, fingers digging in through my work jacket, and I turned to see Lysa, another loader from my shift. Her eyes wide and wet and reflecting the fire above, like they were trying to hold on to something stable. "What do we do?" she asked, and I hated her for it, for putting the weight on me, as if I knew anything more than she did, as if my heartbeat wasn't smashing itself against my ribs like a caged thing. But there was no one else, no sergeant, no priest, no Vox officer, just us and the sky and the sound of the hive getting torn apart from above. So I swallowed the taste of dust and fear and said the only thing that made sense: we go down. Down was always safer in the hive. That was the lie we grew up with. Anyway, down into the thicker walls, the deeper corridors, the places where you couldn't see the stars and so could pretend they weren't trying to kill you. We pushed into the flow of bodies heading for the interior stairwells, shoulders slamming into shoulders, someone sobbing, someone laughing too loud, that hysterical kind of laugh that sounds like it belongs to someone who's already fallen and hasn't hit the ground yet. The emergency lumen strips flickered, turning faces into jerking snapshots, pale, grey, red with exertion, teeth clenched around whispered prayers, lips mouthing Emperor Protect so often it became a reflex rather than a plea, and overhead, somewhere in the distance, something huge screamed as it tore through the outer spires, a sound like metal shrieking and masonry crying out as it failed. When we reached the stairwell, it was already packed, a jam of bodies trying to occupy the same square meter of space, and the air was hot with breath and fear and the metallic tang of recirculated oxygen. Trying to keep up, someone fell, and the movement of the crowd rolled over them like a wave, feet slipping, boots coming down where a head had been a second before. And I heard the crunch but didn't look down, couldn't look down, because if I saw a face I recognized, I think something in me would have snapped. Lysa's hand disappeared from my arm somewhere between level 120 and 115, swallowed by the crush, and when I shouted her name the only answer was the roar of 1,000 voices, trying not to be the next one underfoot. The alarms changed tone then, a rising tritone I'd only ever heard in drills that always ended with a board arbitrator telling, "US, we'd all be shot if we evacuated that slowly during a real emergency." This time, no one was timing us and no one was laughing, and the Vox crackle came back, harsher. The words barely holding shape, outer defense grid failure confirmed. All citizens seek static shelter. This world is under exterminatus level threat. Repeat, more static, then a sound like someone being dragged from the mic, exterminatus. I'd heard the word in stories, in whispered rumors about worlds that had displeased the wrong authority. But it always sounded like something that happened to other people, far away, in cautionary tales meant to scare children into obedience. Hearing it attached to our world made my spine feel hollow, like the bones had been scooped out. Exterminatus level threat didn't mean we were doomed for sure. It meant somewhere, up there, someone was deciding whether we were worth saving, whether the cost of trying outweighed the efficiency of just burning everything. And that was almost worse than certainty. The idea that our lives might be reduced to a line on some distant Inquisitor's data slate. We didn't stop running. We reached the mid-level habways and spilled out into corridors that had become rivers of people, all flowing toward the same idea, shelter, somewhere, anywhere, as if there was such a thing under a sky that was being peeled open. I remember catching glimpses through high, narrow viewports, the outer hab rings on fire. Great gouts of smoke being sucked upward by the failing atmospherics. A streak of green light ripping horizontally across the horizon that I prayed wasn't what I thought it was. Some xenos lance cutting through the hive's spine. Somewhere, distant but too close to ignore, I heard the bark of lost fire and the deeper, throatier roar of auto weapons, not as a battle, but as pockets of panic being contained by the local arbitrators. Their Vox-amplified commands fraying as the chain of commands snapped link by link under the strain. I don't know when we stopped moving as a crowd and started moving as smaller, breaking pieces. At some point, the huge, terrified mass of people fractured into groups, then into knots, then into individuals drifting down side corridors, diving into maintenance shafts, forcing doors into storage vaults that had never been meant to hold humans, only rations or machine parts. I ended up with maybe a dozen others, faces I recognized from the loading platforms, a couple of happy neighbors, an elderly man who kept clutching a small, battered icon of the Emperor like it. The first thing the apocalypse took from us wasn't the light or the air or the buildings. It was the clock, because somewhere between sealing ourselves into that forgotten substation and the last echo of the world collapsing overhead, time stopped being something you could measure and became something you could only feel. A slow tightening in the gut that began as the tremor of adrenaline fading and settled into the bone-deep awareness that we were trapped, and that trapped things only lived as long as whatever they'd brought in with them, breath, water, food, faith. Whatever you counted as survival, at first it didn't feel real, because the noise above us went on and on, distant concussions rolling through the hive's foundations like the footsteps of angry gods, and we were still riding that thin edge of shock from the run and the sirens, and the void shield tearing open. So we told ourselves this was temporary, that the Arbites or the PDF of the Astra Militarum, or some other uniform we'd only ever seen on recruitment picts, would reassert control any minute now, that the Vox would crackle back to life with a calm, authoritative voice telling us where to report, where to line up, where to stand while the Imperium saved us but the Vox stayed dead. The only sound in the substation the layered breathing of a dozen terrified people and the soft, constant hum of ancient cogitators running routines no one had checked in decades, their machine spirits looping through forgotten diagnostics while the hive above them died. At some point, an hour, 3, a lifetime, the thunder softened, not because whatever was happening outside had stopped, but because the body adjusts. The mind starts filing impossible noise as background just to keep from tearing itself apart, and in the absence of constant fresh terror the smaller truths crept in, mouths drying, stomachs growling, legs cramping from being folded too long on cold metal. The old man with the icon began to cough, a wet, rattling sound that made everyone else flinch, not out of disgust or fear of infection, but because it reminded us that our bodies were still here, still fragile, still breakable in ways that didn't require orbital fire. Talon was the first to say the word we were all avoiding. "How long can we stay?" she asked. Not to anyone in particular, her scar catching the dim cogitator light as she turned her head toward the sealed hatch. No one answered, because answering meant counting, and counting meant admitting we had nothing to count with, no ration packs, no water flasks beyond whatever people had on their belts when the sirens started, no Medicaid. No filters if the air scrubbers in this forgotten little tomb decided they'd given enough to the Emperor. I checked my own pockets like I hadn't already done it 3 times. A half-chewed recaf tab in its wrapper, a dented plastic bottle with maybe 3 fingers of lukewarm, recycled water left, to stim sticks I'd been saving for a double shift. That would now never happen. When I looked up, I saw others doing the same. The little subtle inventory movements, palms opening to show odds and ends. Food reduced to a handful of ration cubes, some pocket bread, a strip of dried protein someone had been planning as a midnight snack. Nobody asked to pull it. We were still too close to before for that. Still too used to the idea that what you had in your pockets was yours, that the tithe had already been taken by life itself long. Before today, the air changed as the hours stretched. The substation had its own tiny recycling system, a humming bank of vents and filters that kept the space from turning into a stale tune too quickly. But even so, the smell of us, fierce sweat, oil, old dust shaken loose from places that hadn't been disturbed since before I was born thickened, wrapping around the lungs with a subtle, nagging weight that made every inhalation feel like a negotiation. Someone tried the Vox unit bolted to the wall, more out of habit than hope. Thumbing the cracked transmit rune over and over, all it gave back was a deep, empty hiss The kind of static that made you think of electrons drifting through dead circuits, like the machine itself was trying to remember how to speak and failing. Maybe the storm's interfering, one of the younger loaders said, his voice brittle around the lie, and an older woman, grey hair plastered to her forehead, snorted softly. Storm, she muttered. That wasn't weather, boy. That was someone deciding we don't matter. No one challenged her, because in the Imperium, you grow up with the understanding that your life is a very small number in someone else's calculation, and you learn to live with it until a day like this, when you discover that knowing it and feeling it are different kinds of pain. The first real argument came with the first real silence. There was a moment, it could have been the 20th or the 50th, all of them blending when the impacts stopped, when the distant booming and grinding faded and nothing replaced it. And in that vacuum of sound a new thought arrived like a cold draft under a door. Maybe it's over. Maybe we can go out. Maybe staying here is the thing that kills us. A hat man named Karen, broad-shouldered, with the permanent squint of someone used to welding mask glare, pushed himself up from the floor with a grunt. We can't sit here waiting like servitors, he said, voice pitched low but firm, the tone of a man who'd argued with foremen often enough to know how to sound certain, even when he wasn't. If the topside's gone, then so are the supply lines. No rations coming, no water, no order. We stay, we starve. We move, maybe we find a way off this rock. That last part was pure fantasy. Off-world was a direction not even dreams pointed. In for people like us, but I understood why he said it. Hope, even the hopeless kind, is an easier sell than stark arithmetic. Talon watched him with narrowed eyes, not angry, just measuring. Move where? She asked. Up. She jerked her chin toward the ceiling. Into whatever did that. She didn't need to specify what that was. The memory of the sky splitting was still fresh enough to sting. Down. She nodded toward the floor, into some porters and corpse recycling. If the lower decks haven't already flooded or collapsed, you think there's a third direction you're hiding from us? Karen bristled, but before he could answer, the old man with the icon spoke. His voice papery but clear. We move when we must, he said, not when we are afraid of staying still. There was a tiny, bitter laugh from someone in the gloom. We're already afraid, she said. We're just choosing which fear we like better. The argument didn't explode into shouts, not yet. It frayed instead, into mutters and sharp asides and the rustling sound of people, quietly choosing sides in their heads. I said nothing, because my mind wouldn't sit still long enough. It kept bouncing between images. Lysa's finger sliding off my arm in the crush, the violet sky. The word exterminatus hanging in the air like smoke, the feel of the icons. Worn edges against my palm, and somewhere in that jumble, hunger finally sharpened from background ache into something that made my thoughts shorter, meaner, more desperate. Eventually, we did the thing you always do when faced with an impossible decision and too few facts. We compromised badly. Talon insisted we wait out one cycle, an arbitrary span marked by the flicker pattern of the lumen strips as they dimmed slightly and then brightened again. A maintenance function we elevated into a kind of ritual dawn, before sending a small group out to scout, just far enough to see if the main corridors were impassable, if there was any sign of organized response, if the world outside the substation was fire, flood, or something we didn't yet have a word for. Karen volunteered immediately, of course, as if the idea had been his all along. A scrawny, sharp-eyed girl from intake named Yoni went with him, along with a middle-aged habwoman whose name I didn't know, but whose eyes had the flat, measuring calm of someone who'd seen riots before and walked away. I almost offered to go to, the instinct to move, to do something, twitching in my muscles like a stim jolt, but when I stood, my knees trembled in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue, and Tolan's hand settled briefly, firmly on my shoulder, a wordless command to stay put. We need someone who knows how to read loading schedules, she said, half mocking, half not. What she meant was, you're rattled enough already. Let someone else see how bad it is first. They left through the hatch with only a short, heavy silence as farewell. the kind that doesn't dare become a goodbye, and the metal panel clanged shut behind them with a finality that made the substation feel smaller by half. After that, time really did dissolve. There is a special kind of torment in waiting underground while the apocalypse burns itself out. Above you, your mind keeps trying to fill in what your eyes can't see, drawing on picked feeds from propaganda, reels and half-whispered stories of other worlds that had fallen, stitching together images of Tyranid spores raining down like rotten stars, or orc rocks punching through atmospheres like fists, or traitor fleets painting the sky in lance-fire. And because you don't know which horror you've been given, you end up with all of them. Ghosts of every nightmare fighting for space in your head. The hunger deepened, layered now with thirst, tongues growing heavy, lips sticking. Every sip from a shared bottle becoming both a relief and a little eulogy for the water. That was gone. Someone started to cry quietly in the corner, not the gasping. Hysterical sobs of fresh shock, but the slow, exhausted weeping of a body choosing one outlet for stress over another. No one told them to stop. But the sound worked its way into them. We didn't decide to go deeper because it was smart. We went because staying where we were meant watching the food shrink and the water thin, and our nerves fray down to nothing. And sooner or later someone was going to snap and turn the substation into a different kind of battlefield. So, when the second artificial day came and the lumen strips brightened, and the vents gave a tired cough like they were already regretting still working, Talon looked around at the circle of hollow eyes and said what we were all secretly waiting to hear. We need to see what's under us. The words landed heavy, not because they were surprising, but because they made the direction of our fear literal. Down had always been the place you joked about. The sump stories you told in the habs, mutants in the dark, waste floods, forgotten servitors wandering centuries-old maintenance tunnels, still trying to complete their last orders, but in the apocalypse. Up was for fire and falling ships, and sideways was for panic and stampedes and people with guns and not enough reasons not to use them. So the only direction left for cowards and survivors was down, and I had never been brave enough to be anything but both. We chose a team again, Talon, because no one argued when she volunteered. Yoni, because her sharp little eyes had seen the worst of the corridors already and she hadn't broken. Karen, half because he insisted and half because if he stayed in the substation much longer it felt like he'd start a fight. And me, because when Torland's gaze swept over the rest and landed on me, I didn't look away quickly enough. The old man pressed the icon into my hand before we left, his fingers lingering over mine for a second like he was passing more than metal. If there is any light left in this world, it's beneath the stone, not above it, he said. And I didn't know whether that was theology or just the bitterness of someone who'd outlived too many mid-hive promises. But I nodded like he'd blessed me and slid the aquila into my jacket pocket, where it lay against my ribs like a second, smaller heart. The maintenance duct that led down was narrower and meaner than the one we'd used to reach the substation. A shaft lined with cables fat as my thigh and others thin as hair, all bound together in grubby bundles. The whole thing steep enough that we had to go sideways along a built-in ladder, boots sliding on rungs polished by generations of forgotten tech priests and servitors. The air grew thicker almost immediately, not just with dust but with a damp, mineral tang that spoke of some reservoirs and waste treatment plants, the places that kept the hive alive but were never mentioned in the propaganda reels, unless they needed volunteers. The sounds from above faded as we descended, the distant groans of the ruined superstructure, the occasional muted boom of something still collapsing, replaced by a slow, rhythmic thump that vibrated through the metal, too regular to be random like a gigantic, tired heart deep beneath us still trying to keep pace with a body that had already bled out. Sump pumps, Karen muttered over his shoulder, his voice echoing dully in the shaft, more to reassure himself than to inform us. Or main recycler engines. Means we've still got power somewhere. Or it means whatever's down there is already drowning. Yoni whispered, and no one told her to shut up, because it was easier to let the fear be spoken than to pretend we hadn't all thought it. After what felt like an hour of climbing, but was probably less, the shaft ended at a rusted hatch stamped with the sigil of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Half worn away by grime, a skull split between flesh and metal, teeth bared in a permanent, silent binary scream. There were warning pictograms too, as glyphs, pick lines about authorized personnel only, something about pressure differentials. All irrelevant now, because if the apocalypse had given us anything, it was blanket authorization to break every rule that used to keep us politely suicidal. Instead of openly desperate, Talon pressed her ear to the hatch, eyes closed, then nodded once and spun the manual release wheel. It resisted at first, then turned with a shudder, shedding flakes of oxidized metal like dead skin, and a breath of air exhaled through the widening gap, wet and cold and smelling of chemicals, rot, and something sharp that made my sinuses ache. The space beyond wasn't a corridor so much as a cavity in the hive's bone, a vast, low-ceiling chamber filled with the bones of machines older than anyone alive, banks of rust-streaked tanks connected by pipes and valves that throbbed faintly, with the passage of liquids you did not want to think too closely about. The floor was a trellis of metal walkways, and maintenance platforms suspended over pools of dark water, the surface broken by churning agitators and the occasional burp of gas. Every sound seemed amplified in there, the drip-drip of leaks, the moan of stressed beams, the hiss of venting steam. Lumen globes hung at irregular intervals, some still burning with a sickly, yellowish light that picked out the edges of the machinery, others dead, leaving pockets of shadow that felt thicker than they should be. "Welcome to the hive's stomach," Karen said softly. "Or its bowels," Yoni muttered. "Or its grave," I added, unable to stop myself. And Talon cut me a sharp look that wasn't quite a rebuke and wasn't quite agreement. We moved slowly, sticking close to the railings, each footstep carefully placed. The metal underfoot was slick in places, tacky in others, and once, when Yoni's boot slipped near a narrow gap, the sound of something heavy and unseen shifting in the water below made us all freeze. Until the ripples settled, there were signs that we weren't the first humans down here. A discarded hab boot lodged in a drainage grill, a thin trail of wax on the platform edge where someone had once carried a candle, a tattered length of prayer ribbon tied around a valve handle, its faded script promising the Emperor would keep the mechanism running, in exchange for a life lived righteously far above. The machine had kept running. I wondered where the petitioner was now, and whether their righteousness had been weighed against falling ships and failing void shields, and found wanting simply because it wasn't loud enough. At the far end of the chamber, beyond a cluster of groaning filtration towers, we found a maintenance junction around, hub-like space where several tunnels met, its walls lined with access panels and old cogitator banks, some smashed, others still humming quietly to themselves like senile old men muttering in their sleep. A half-finished shrine had been built there once, scavenged from scrap, a crude icon of the Omnissiah, half cork, half sunburst, welded together and bolted to the wall with a little ledge underneath for offerings, now empty except for a single, dusty data slate whose screen had long since died. Beside it, someone had scratched a message into the metal with a tooltip, "We keep IT running. No one keeps US." The words hit me harder than any orbital strike. They were small, petty rebellion. The kind that bubbles up among maintenance crews and work gangs and is usually bled out of them by discipline or sheer exhaustion. But in the context of this broken world, it felt like a prophecy no one intended to write. Karen ran his fingers over the letters, his jaw tight. "Tex," he said. "They do the work. The priests chant over it and take the credit. Guess the priests didn't come down here when the sirens went." Torland's eyes swept the junction, weighing roots the way she used to weigh the best way to shift a load through a crowded deck. "If we can get deeper into the utility tunnels, we might find an old hab shelter," she said. "The kind they built before everything relied on central systems. Or storage or emergency ration caches, or sump ghouls," Yoni said lightly. But her voice had too much strain in it to pass as a joke. "Or rat leaks," Karen added. "Or structural collapses. Or we stand here and list ways to die until one of them decides to find us," I cut in, harsher than I meant to. The echo of my own voice came back thin and accusing. Silence slid in after that, the four of us caught in the same tight loop of fear and necessity. Then Talon picked a tunnel, not the largest or the smallest, not the one with the strongest draft or the clearest lumen glow, just one that angled downward at a manageable slope and didn't immediately scream death. And we followed because leadership in times like these isn't about best choices, just choices made quickly enough that doubt doesn't have time to grow teeth. The tunnel beyond the junction felt older than the chamber we'd left, its walls less regular, the pipework more haphazard, as if it had been dug in a hurry and then repurposed a dozen times over the centuries. Here and there, the original rockreek gave way to bare rock, black and slick with condensation, and under the smell of machine oil and chemicals there was a deeper, earthier scent that made something primitive in my brain twitch uneasily. The thumping of the sump engines faded behind us, replaced by closer. Smaller sounds, the scuttle of unseen vermin in the walls, the drip of water from cracked overhead conduits, the occasional skittering clatter of small stones dislodged by our passing. Once, distant but clear, there was another sound, a low, drawn-out screech like metal being bent very slowly by an implacable force, followed by a muffled roar and a tremor underfoot that sent dust trickling from the ceiling. Another collapse, Karen said. Above or below? Yoni asked. No one knew and no one wanted to guess, after a while measured only by the increasing ache in my calves and the dryness on my tongue. The tunnel widened into a broader passageway with a higher ceiling and more substantial support arches. Faded stank. We had survived hunger, thirst, panic, and the first blind thrash of the world ending. But nothing prepares you for the moment hope slithers back into the cracks of your fear. Because hope in the Imperium is never clean or gentle, it arrives sharp-edged and suspicious, wearing a dozen masks: faith, rumor, misunderstanding. Outright lies, and you have to decide whether grabbing it will save you or cut your hand open. And it was on the third day in the substation, the vents wheezing like tired lungs and the ration bricks already running low again. That hope found us in the form of a sound that should not have existed, a deep, bone-shaking thunder that wasn't an explosion, wasn't a collapse, wasn't the groan of metal dying, but something heavier, more deliberate, a rhythmic, distant boom that made the dust in the ceiling drift downward in lazy spirals. And for a few confused heartbeats, we all froze, staring at one another with the same unspoken question: is someone fighting back? The old man was the first to voice it, clutching his icon so tightly his knuckles went white beneath the grime. Angels, he whispered, and it was ridiculous. A word you only said in hymns or in stories meant to frighten children into obedience. But the way his voice cracked around it sent a ripple through the room, an invisible shiver that tightened every spine. Karen scoffed immediately, the sound brittle with exhaustion. Astartes don't come for places like this, he said, running a hand over his stubble as if trying to massage sense back into his skull. If they were here, we'd know. Whole hive would be shaking. This is just more collapse. But even as he said it, the deep booming came again, evenly spaced like footsteps, and Yoni's wide dark eyes fixed on the ceiling, as though she could see through the layers of machinery and stone. It's too regular, she murmured. It's not debris. Something's walking. The word walking did something to me. It pried open a memory I didn't know I still had from old. Recruitment picked feeds shown in the hat block. Grainy footage of giants in ceramite armor striding through smoke, their bolters roaring, their footfalls like gods stepping down the spine of a world. Astartes, space marines, living myths wrapped in gene-robbed flesh and armor that shone like relics. But the next memory hit harder. Instructions screamed at us during sermons: if the angels come, they come for war, not rescue. Do not stand in their way. Do not approach. The angels serve only the Emperor's will, not your hope. And this thought sat heavy in my gut. Even if they were here, even if some Astartes chapter had arrived, what would they see us as? Citizens, survivors, or obstacles between them and an enemy big enough to break our sky? It didn't matter, because rumor had already outrun reason in the room. People were whispering now, voices rising and falling like a strange tide, stories about a cousin who'd once seen the salamanders on a mining moon, about a friend of a friend who had lived through an Ultramarine's purge, about the time a drop pod had supposedly landed in a neighboring hive. and the angels had led the survivors to safety, that one was obviously a lie. But no one challenged it now. The old man's voice was the loudest, trembling with desperate conviction. They heard us. The Emperor sent them. He will not abandon those who call his name. And Talon shot him a look so sharp it might have cut steel. The Emperor doesn't send anyone, she said quietly. And if someone came, it wasn't for us. But even she couldn't keep the edge of fear out of her voice, not fear of the enemy. We didn't understand, but fear of hope itself. Hope makes you reckless. Hope gets you killed. The booming came again, slightly closer, and the lumen strips flickered once, twice, then steadied. Everything in the substation seemed to hold its breath. Finally Talon stood, rolling her shoulders as though trying to shrug off a weight she didn't ask for. "We need to see," she said. "Not guess, not pray. See?" Karen muttered that she was insane, but he was already grabbing his tool pack, because arguing with Talon was like arguing with gravity. Yoni stepped up beside her without hesitation, and before I could stop myself, I pushed to my feet too. My legs trembling from hunger and nerves, but my chest tight with something like obligation, because if giants were walking in the ruins of the hive, I needed to know whether they were coming to save us or crush us underfoot. Without noticing we existed, we left the substation again, following the same maintenance ducts that had become our arteries into the corpse of the hive. But this time we moved upward instead of down, the tunnels narrowing as they climbed, the smell of burnt metal growing stronger, the air hotter and filled with a faint static crackle that made the hair on my arms rise. Twice we had to squeeze through gaps left by collapsed beams. Once we passed a vent that opened into a main corridor, and what we saw there nearly drove us back underground, a vast gouge torn through the wall. The floor buckled and split, scorch marks found across every surface like dark wings. And at the far end of the corridor something huge and metallic dragged itself across the rubble. Glowing eyes flickering in a cracked skull plate, its servos whining like animals in pain. A broken servitor, half crushed under masonry, still trying to follow whatever ancient command it had been given before the sky fell. Talon didn't let us linger. She pulled us onward, off the main corridor and into a side shaft where the booming noise grew louder, clearer, almost rhythmic. Not footsteps, at least not human ones. Something else. Something heavier. Something powered. It was Yoni who reached the grate first. A square of rusted mesh bolted into the wall overlooking a wider chamber above. And when she looked through it, her breath hitched so sharply that Talon grabbed her shoulder, thinking she was hurt. "What is it?" she hissed. Yoni pointed, her hand trembling. "Look, I don't know what I expected. Chaos, xenos, demons, angels, but nothing prepared me for the sight through that grate." The chamber above was a transit hub, or what had once been one, a huge open space with multiple rail lines running through it, now shattered, flooded with smoke, illuminated only by the stuttering flames of broken power conduits. Bodies lay everywhere, most of them scorched or crushed, but a few still burned with the eerie blue-white glow of plasma residue. And walking slowly, deliberately, through the carnage was a giant. Not 10 meters tall, those were myths, but towering all the same. Easily 8 feet, even hunched under the low ceiling. Clad in armor the color of deep crimson and blackened ceramite edged with gold trim. The left pauldron marked with a symbol I had never seen, but felt like I should bow to. A skull wreathed in stylized wings, crowned with laurels. A space marine. A real one. An angel of death. He carried a bolter the size of my torso in one hand, the muzzle still smoking. His armor was scorched and dented, splattered with ash. But he moved with the calm precision of someone who had walked through war so many times that it no longer registered as danger. Behind him, limping slightly on one damaged servo, came another figure, smaller but still colossal, wearing a tech harness bristling with mechadendrites, red robes torn and stained. The augmetic face bowed as he muttered Binharic prayers. A tech marine. My breath caught in my throat. It felt like watching a pig trail come alive. The old man had been right. Angels had come to our world. But as the marine paused, surveying the ruined transit hub with a slow, grim sweep of his helm, a cold realization spread through me. He wasn't looking for survivors. He wasn't calling out. He wasn't scanning for life signs. He was hunting something, or clearing a path, or executing orders that didn't include us. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a thunderous growl that echoed through the chamber. Area secure. Proceed with the purge pattern. Purge. The word hit me like an impact. Karen cursed under his breath. Talon stiffened. Yoni looked like she might be sick. The tech marine responded in metallic binharic clicks and warbled machine chant. And from somewhere deeper in the hive came another sound, mechanical, massive. Heavier sound I recognized from distant training vids even though I'd never seen one. The metallic roar of a dreadnought awakening. That sealed it. This wasn't a rescue mission. This wasn't salvation descending from the heavens. This was extermination. Containment. The Emperor's angels had come, yes, but not for us. They had come to cleanse the world of whatever threat had brought the enemy to our skies. And cleansing did not leave room for the survival of the uncounted masses. Who lived in the hive's forgotten organs? We have to go, Talon whispered urgently. Now, if they see us, she didn't finish the sentence because she didn't need to. Everyone in the Imperium knows what happens when civilians obstruct an Astartes operation. We backed away from the grate slowly, every breath held, every footstep placed like we were walking on broken glass. The booming footsteps of the Marine moved deeper into the transit hub, and the chamber filled with the roar of machinery, the hiss of igniting promethium, and the crack, crack, crack of bolter fire. By the time we reached the substation again, my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the icon when the old man asked for it back. People clustered around us immediately, bombarding us with questions. What did you see? What was the noise? Was it rescue? Are the angels here? Are we saved? And each question felt like a weight added to my chest, because I had to look into those expectant faces and tell them the truth. Space Marines are here, but they're not here for us. Silence fell like a dropped hammer. The old man's face crumpled in a way that made me. Choice is a luxury the Imperium never taught us to hold gently, because most of the time we never had one. Our lives laid out in work schedules, ration allotments, curfews, and compulsory sermons. But the apocalypse twisted the truth into something cruel, giving us too many choices at once, each one sharp-edged and soaked in consequences. And on the artificial night after we saw the angels walking the ruined transit hub above, the substation felt like the pressure chamber for a decision none of us wanted to touch. Even breathing felt loud, as if the wrong exhale would draw the attention of giants in ceramite armor, or whatever enemy they were hunting through the collapsing hive. Talon paced near the cogitator wall, her boots silent on the metal floor, eyes distant in that way she got when her mind sifted through options. The way she once sifted through supply chains, eliminating impossible routes, measuring risks with instincts sharpened by years of surviving supervisors, shortages and arbitrary punishments. Karen alternated between muttering curses and staring at the ceiling, like he expected a bolt around to come straight down through it. Yoni kept turning the same empty ration wrapper over and over between her fingers, as if hoping it might refill itself if she prayed hard enough. The old man clutched his icon so tightly it dug into his skin, small beads of blood rising between the tiny feathers of the aquila. No one slept. No one spoke at first. When the silence finally cracked, it was because the hive itself gave us no more room to avoid the question, stay underground, and hope the angels ignored us, or move, flee, gamble, try to outrun whatever holy firestorm the Astartes were about to unleash. A distant explosion answered before any of us could, one so powerful. It shook fine dust from the ceiling, sending it cascading over us like grey snow, followed by a low mechanical roar that made my teeth ache, the kind of sound a machine makes when its entire existence is devoted to violence. A dreadnought firing. I had seen picked feeds, training vids meant to inspire awe and obedience. Images of ancient warriors interred in walking sarcophagi, their broken bodies wired into towering war machines that spat death with every gesture. But hearing one in real life was different, deeper, more final, as though the noise itself erased the space it traveled through. If the angels were deploying dreadnoughts, this wasn't a cleansing operation, it was annihilation. The hive wasn't being saved. It was being punished. "We can't stay," Talon said, her voice flat but steady, cutting through the panic before it could swell again. "If they start purging sectors, they won't check for civilians. They won't ask. They'll assume everything down here is either dead or corrupted. And if we're lucky, they'll be right." Karen barked a bitter laugh. "And if we're unlucky, we'll learn what a bolt around feels like from the inside," Yoni said quietly. Karen shot her a glare, but fear had cracked his bravado. He rubbed the back of his neck and avoided our eyes. The old man surprised us by speaking next, his voice soft but unwavering. "We must go where their shadows don't fall." Talon nodded. "Which means down again. Past the sump, past the recycling levels, down to the deep transit rails. If there's any part of the hive the angels will ignore, it's the places even the administratum pretended didn't exist." Karen made a sound halfway between dread and disbelief. "The deep rails? You mean the black tunnels? The places they sealed during the plague outbreak?" "Sealed is hopeful," Yoni muttered. "They just put a warning sign and hoped we died before reaching them." Tolan's jaw tightened. "Listen, we either stay here and die when they purge this district, or we go deeper and die later. One of those gives us time. Time is life. And there it was, our terrible, inevitable choice laid bare. Life measured in hours, not years. Existence trading itself for more existence. Survival reduced to buying time from the universe with the only currency we had left. Our willingness to keep moving when everything begged us to stop." The debate turned ugly fast. Voices rose. Accusations flew. Someone shouted that Talon wanted to lead us into a tomb. Someone else insisted that staying was suicide. A woman I barely knew started crying quietly in the corner, her hands shaking so violently she dropped her water flask and didn't bother to pick it up. The old man tried to calm everyone, whispering prayers, but even he couldn't drown out the fear building like pressure behind our ribs. At the height of the argument, the hatch to the maintenance shaft rattled once, twice as if something had brushed against it from the other side. Every sound stopped. Every throat tightened, every eye snapped to that door. Then came a noise so soft it barely existed, a faint metallic scrape, like fingers dragging along the hatch surface. Not knocking, not trying to open, just moving, searching. I don't know how long we held the collective breath. It felt like hours, when the scraping finally passed, swallowed by the labyrinth of tunnels beyond. No one needed to ask what it was. Not the angels, not a servitor, not a survivor. Something else, something stirred by the ruin of the hive, something drawn to the warmth of life like a dying animal sniffing its way to a last meal. And that, more than any argument Talon could make, forced our decision. We couldn't stay. Staying wasn't safety. Staying was waiting in line for the next horror. Slowly, painfully, we gathered what we could carry again: ration bricks, water canisters, a few tools, the salvaged lascan the nameless woman had taken from the crushed arbitrator, the icon the old man refused to let go. Talon outlined the path in quick, clipped instructions, back through the sump processing chamber, past the junction where the servitors lined the walls, down the auxiliary transit corridor, then into the deep rail access shafts. Once we reach the rails, we follow them until we find an interchange, she said. Maybe one that connects to the old mag-line tunnels. If we can get far enough from this district, we might find sections the angels haven't reached, or we find the things the angels were sent. Here to kill, Karen muttered. No one contradicted him. Fear doesn't disappear just because you choose a direction it travels with you, pressed between your ribs like a second spine. Leaving the substation felt like abandoning a grave we had almost grown comfortable in. The stale warmth of the vents, the dim, predictable pulse of the lumen strips, the bodies sleeping in uneasy clusters. All of it became background as we slipped into the maintenance shaft and sealed the hatch behind us, with a silent understanding that we would never see that place again. The sump chamber was worse this time, not because it had changed, but because we had. The shadows looked deeper. The water churned louder. The hanging servitor husks seemed to shiver at the edge of vision. Every dripping pipe sounded like footsteps. Every echo felt like breath on the back of my neck. When we reached the servitor corridor, Their flickering eyes seemed to follow us more deliberately, as if some ghost of the machine spirits inside them sensed the chaos in the hive above, and strained against failing logic routines, their artificial mouths twitching in silent attempts to form words no one living could understand. I found myself whispering "Don't look at me" under my breath as I passed them, like a child walking past a graveyard. Yoni flinched when one of them made a wet clicking sound. Some was firing cogitator reflex left over from centuries of forgotten labor. The old man murmured a prayer. Karen quickened his pace. Talon kept her eyes forward, jaw set, shoulders tense. When we finally reached Transit Auxiliary 7C, the corridor that led to the emergency refuge where the dead still sat in neat rows, the air changed again. They had begun to smell. Slightly. Just enough to remind us that death wasn't a thing of the past. It was something waiting around every corner. Talon didn't let us linger. She guided us into a side passage I hadn't noticed before. A narrow tunnel choked with dust and machinery parts piled against the wall's old track components. Decommissioned data conduits, coils of cable so ancient they crumbled at the edges. The descent steepened. The air cooled. The smell of some porter gave way to something older, more sterile, the scent of ancient stone. Untouched air, sealed places. Then we reached the deep rail shaft. A cavernous, impossible space carved straight through the hive like a wound, stretching farther than any lumen strips could illuminate. The tracks thick and rusted but unmistakably real. To massive lines of metal running into blackness, so complete it felt alive. The silence hit us like pressure. Not the silence of empty rooms or abandoned factories. This was deeper, heavier. A silence that felt like it had mass, as if sound itself had been exiled from this place long before we ever arrived. Emperor! Karen breathed. No wonder they abandoned this. They didn't abandon it, Talon said quietly. They sealed it. On purpose. And I believed her because the air had that taste, the metallic, stale quality of zones quarantined after plagues, after heresy outbreaks, after infestations of things no one wrote about in public records. Yoni shivered. We're really doing this, she whispered. We're going into the tunnels they closed during the plague. We don't have a choice, I said, surprised at my own certainty. Choice died when the angels woke their dreadnought, and with that we stepped onto the deep rails, into darkness so absolute it felt like a living thing drawing itself around us, swallowing the last traces of the world above the angels, the hunger, the fire. The sky that broke in, leaving us alone with the one truth the apocalypse had been trying to tee. The deep rails swallowed us whole the moment we stepped onto them, taking not just our light but something subtler, the sense of being tethered to the world we had always known, because the upper hive, even ruined, burning, collapsing, still felt like a place built for people, built to contain their footsteps and their noise and their endless, miserable work. But the tunnels beneath that world were different, built for machines, built for speed, built for silence, built to be forgotten. And as our lumen lamps flickered in the vast dark, I felt an ancient, instinctive fear rising in the pit of my stomach, the kind that whispers you have gone somewhere you were never meant to walk. The rails stretched ahead of us into thick, parallel lines of pitted steel, disappearing into a black so complete it felt like standing at the edge of a starless void. Above us, the ceiling curved into a ribbed arch lost in shadow, every supporting beam and gantry swallowed by darkness, and the air itself tasted different, thin, metallic, still, as if it had been trapped down here so long it barely remembered how to move. We walked single file, our breaths loud enough to sound like heresy, each step echoing too far, bouncing strangely off the cavern walls until the echoes came back twisted, delayed, like someone or something was pacing us just out of sight. Karen kept muttering under his breath, half curses, half reassurance to himself. Yoni walked with her arms folded tightly across her chest, lamp pressed close to her body. The old man whispered prayers so softly they brushed the air like moth wings. And Talon, as always, led us forward with that rigid, stubborn determination that made her look braver than she felt. The deeper we went, the older the tunnels became, girders warped by time, rust scaling the walls like diseased skin. Old warning pictograms slashed through with claw marks or eroded into nonsense. Once, we passed a sealed quarantine door 3 floors high. Its locking clamps fused decades ago, the yellow and black hazard stripes faded but still visible, along with smeared handprints on the outside where someone had once pounded desperately. From our side of the seal, Yoni stopped when she saw those prints. "This is where they trapped them," she whispered. "The plague victims, or the things that carried the plague," Karen muttered. And no one corrected him because the echo of his voice sounded like it belonged to someone already dead. After that, the darkness felt heavier, thicker, like it was listening. More than once I thought I heard things moving far off, soft dragging sounds, faint tapping on metal, low groans carried by old ventilation ducts, but every time I froze and swung my lamp around, the darkness held its breath, pretending innocence. The worst part was the sense that the tunnels remembered what had happened here, the outbreaks, the screams, the purges, the ceiling doors slamming shut with hundreds trapped behind them. And that memory soaked into the stone itself until it became a presence, not alive, not dead, just aware. Even the air felt older than ours, heavy with the ghosts of machinery long since silenced. After maybe an hour, though time had no meaning, down here we found the first sign of motion. A rail cart half buried in debris. A massive slab of metal that had once belonged to a mag train designed to carry tens of thousands between hive spires in minutes. Now it lay on its side like a dead beast, half melted, half rotted. The passenger windows cracked into spiderweb fractures. Inside, the seats were still arranged in neat rows, though the people who once filled them had long since turned to brittle outlines of dust. A single skull rolled free as we passed, tapping lightly against a rail like it was asking to be remembered. We didn't touch anything, didn't speak. The silence in the cart felt wrong, too tight, too concentrated, as if the air inside had been inhaled in terror centuries ago and never released. Further ahead, the tunnels narrowed around a rocky choke point where a collapse had forced the rails upward into a jagged incline. Talon tested the edge with her boot, frowning. "We can climb it," she said, "but carefully. The structure isn't stable." Karen grumbled but didn't argue. Yoni tested a handhold and began climbing first, light and quick as always. The old man struggled, his hands shaking with exertion, so I moved behind him, steadying him when his foot slipped on loose rubble. Halfway up, a deep sound rolled through the tunnel like distant breathing. Not mechanical, not wind, not normal. Something vast shifting in the dark. Everyone froze. The sound came again, low, resonant, vibrating the rails beneath us. "Emperor preserve us," the old man whispered. Talon gestured sharply, warning us not to speak, not to breathe, not to move. The darkness below us pulsed faintly with the sound, like something brushing the stone floor miles away, but still strong enough to travel up through the bones of the hive. It wasn't footsteps. It wasn't machinery. It was alive. Slowly, painfully, we resumed climbing, reaching the crest of the collapse and peering into the next chamber. And for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. The tunnel opened into a massive vault, an abandoned interchange station, wider than a manufacturing assembly block. Its ceiling lost somewhere in the dark, its walls lined with dormant cogitators and broken conveyor tracks. Old lumen globes hung from above in tangled clusters, some shattered, some flickering faintly with half-dead power cells. But it wasn't the architecture that made my blood run cold. It was the marks on the floor, deep gouges carved into the metal decking, long furrows that looked like something had been dragged or had dragged itself across the chamber, claw marks deeper than my hand, a trail of torn metal leading into a ventilation shaft big enough for a tank to drive through. "What made those?" Yoni whispered, voice trembling. "Something that survived down here," Talon said quietly, studying the gouges. "Something that learned to thrive where the rest died. Something the angels might have come for." Karen added grimly, and that thought rooted itself in me like a thorn. The Astartes weren't just purging the upper hive, because the war above was too violent. They were driving something downward, something they couldn't risk escaping. We were walking into its path. We crossed the interchange as fast as we dared. following the rail lines until they split into 3 branching tunnels. The left tunnel yawned open, breathing out a cold, damp mist that smelled faintly of decay. The right tunnel crackled with residual energy, the faint hum of a long-dead mag line coil occasionally flickering like a heartbeat. The middle tunnel was silent, not quiet, truly silent, the kind of silence that makes your instincts scream. Middle, Talon decided. It's the only one not broadcasting a warning. I wasn't convinced, but none of us had the strength to argue. The middle tunnel sloped downward again, more sharply this time, forcing us to brace ourselves against the smooth rail supports. The deeper we went, the more the air changed from metallic to damp, from damp to cold, from cold to something else entirely, a kind of stillness that clung to the skin like oil. The lumen lamps flickered more often. Once, mine went out entirely for 3 heartbeats. In that moment of pitch dark, I heard something move behind us, soft, skittering, close. When the light returned, nothing was there. Yoni grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my sleeve. "Don't turn around," she whispered. "If you hear it again, don't turn around." "Why?" I breathed. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the faint lumen glow. Because things that follow in the deep don't want to be seen. They want you to look back. They want your attention. I didn't ask how she knew. I didn't want to know. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened again, this time into a maintenance platform overlooking an abyss. A literal abyss? A chasm so deep even our brightest lamp couldn't find the bottom. A narrow walkway spanned it, rusted and trembling, swaying slightly with the faint vibrations running through the hive's foundations. Across the chasm was another platform, and beyond that, tunnels, many tunnels, a labyrinth. "We're lost," Karen said flatly. "We're not lost," Talon countered. "We're choosing." "Choosing what?" "Which darkness kills us the slowest?" She moved on to the walkway first. It groaned under her weight, metal protesting, bolts shifting. A small cascade of rust drifted down into the black beneath us. I waited for the sound to hit bottom. It never did. We crossed one by one, Talon first, then Yoni, then the old man, then me, then Karen. Halfway across, the deep rails behind us trembled. A gust of cold air swept the chasm like a massive exhale. A shadow moved far off in the dark. A shape, a wrongness, something enormous, something hunting. "Move!" Talon hissed. "Move now!" We bolted for the other side, stumbling onto the platform just as something huge shifted in the darkness we'd left behind. The faint glow of our lamps catching only the outline of movement, too many limbs, too much mass, and a sound like bone grinding on stone. Then the darkness swallowed it. Talon didn't wait. She led us into one of the branching tunnels, this one narrow, angled low, forcing us to crouch. The air grew warmer as we crawled, almost humid. The faint sound of machinery returned, slow, rhythmic. Mechanical thumps that echoed through the stone like a heartbeat. "That's infrastructure," Karen whispered. "Old macro pumps. Or reactors." "Reactors?" Yoni hissed. "Are you insane? If a reactor's still running down here, if it were unstable," he shot back, "we'd already be dead." I didn't argue. The tunnel widened again, and we spilled into another chamber along. Low hall filled with rows of ancient pipes thicker than my torso, steam valves. The moment that warm air breathed out of the sanctum door, soft and incongruously clean against our sweat-streaked faces, we felt the first fragile flicker of something like deliverance, so faint it was almost painful to recognize, like a memory of sunlight in a world that had forgotten the sky. But it vanished as quickly as it came, because behind us, echoing up the tunnel we had crawled through, came the unmistakable sound of pursuit, the heavy scrape of something vast dragging metal against stone, punctuated by chittering tones that vibrated in my teeth and made the lumen filaments lining the corridor flicker in protest. And in that instant, every instinct I had screamed that whatever had survived down here in the dark had finally found prey bold or stupid enough to wander into its hunting grounds. Talon didn't hesitate. She shoved the sanctum door wider and ordered us inside with a sharp gesture. Her voice a harsh whisper, "Move!" We stumbled across the threshold, blinking as the interior bloomed with dim, amber light triggered by our presence. The old man crossed himself with a trembling hand. Yoni let out a thin, wordless gasp, Karen cursed under his breath in awe, and I felt my pulse thunder in my ears as the sanctum revealed itself an ancient bunker, carved directly into the stone of the hive's substructure. Its walls smooth and curved, reinforced with rock plates reinforced by metal ribs that looked almost ceremonial, embossed with Mechanica script praising preservation, continuity, and a sacred duty of maintenance. Rows of alcoves lined the chamber, each housing what had once been survival pods tall, coffin-like machines with faded runes and cracked screens, most standing open and empty like the husks of giant metallic seeds. An old cogitator bank hummed faintly in one corner, dust thick on its surface but its core still glowing a soft, soothing blue. And deeper inside, past the pods, a small garden of bioluminescent fungi glowed softly, casting pale green light into a recessed chamber where water dripped in slow, steady rhythm from pipes overhead into a shallow basin. Life, actual life, manufactured and forgotten, but living still. It felt obscene, like sacrilege, to find something gentle surviving in the belly of the hive after everything we had seen above. But there was no time to breathe, no time to marvel, no time to feel anything but terror because the sound behind us was growing louder, closer, angrier, the scrape turning into a grinding pull, as though claws the size of shovels were dragging across the tunnel walls. "Close it," Karen rasped, grabbing the inner edge of the door. Talon was already turning the manual wheel, muscles standing out in her arms as the rusted mechanism groaned and shuddered. Yoni and I threw our weight into it, pushing until my shoulder felt like it was splitting apart. The wheel spun, the locking rods engaged one by one with deep metallic thunks. But as the door reached its final few inches, something slammed against the other side hard enough to jolt the entire chamber and knock us backward. The old man cried out. The fungi lights dimmed. The cogitator stuttered in its humming. Talon gritted her teeth, forcing the wheel another fraction of a turn. But then came a new sound, a hiss, followed by a long, low growl that didn't sound like it belonged to anything human or machine. The door bulged inward, bending slightly under the pressure of something massive on the other side. And for an instant a thin line of shadow leaked through the seam, moving, shivering, pressed close enough that I could almost imagine seeing a shape behind it. A hand or claw or tendril or something worse. Yoni let out a broken gasp. Karen swore viciously. The old man began reciting a prayer so fast it was almost gibberish. I threw all my weight into the wheel, shoulder screaming in protest, and felt the metal shift just barely, just enough until the final locking rod slammed home with a sound like a gunshot. Silence followed. A terrible, waiting silence. Then the thing outside struck the door again. The sanctum walls shook. Dust drifted from the ceiling in a lazy cloud. Another strike, louder, closer, the metal dents inward. Something dragged across the door's outer plating with a screech that made my skin crawl, like Talon's testing weak points. Reinforced rockreet, Talon whispered to herself, eyes flicking across the sanctum's interior as though reading an invisible schematic. This bunker was built to withstand sector collapses, reactor breaches, even early-phase Tyranid incursions. You think that's a Tyranid? Karen hissed. If it were, we'd already be dead, she snapped. So shut up. The creature outside slammed the door again, harder this time. The entire sanctum shuddered, lights flickering. But the door held, and eventually the pounding stopped. The scratching faded. The dragging echo receded down the corridor like a wave pulling back into darkness. And then silence. We didn't move for a long time. No one breathed deeply, as though oxygen itself might attract the thing back. When we finally pulled ourselves from the floor, hearts still racing, Talon locked the door's secondary seals and stepped back. Exhaustion etched deep into her features. We stay here, she said quietly. At least until we know what's hunting in the tunnels. We can't stay forever, Karen warned. We can't even stay for long. If it can smell us, it smelled us in the corridor, Yoni said. Not in here. The old man nodded solemnly. This place is sanctified, preserved, hidden by purpose. The Omnissiah's mercy lingered here. Talon didn't contradict him, but her eyes lingered on the fungal lights, the functioning water basin, the barely alive cogitator core things that shouldn't have survived a century without maintenance. It was too intact, too awake, too ready, like it had been waiting. I felt the same unease coil in my gut. Something about this sanctum wasn't right, not dangerous, but intentional in a way I couldn't understand. This place hadn't merely endured time it had expected us. Spread out, Talon said finally. Check the pods, the piping. Anything that could help us survive the next few days, we did, or tried to. The sanctum was both larger and smaller than it appeared larger in the central hall, where dozens of stasis pods stood like rusted sarcophagi, but smaller in its depth, as though the bunker had been carved to hold only a specific number of people and no more. Some pods were cracked open at the seams, their interiors filled with dust and nothing else. Others still held remnant scraps of clothing, brittle bones curled like sleeping children, data tags too corroded to read. The old man lingered by one of the pods, tracing its edges. These were meant for long-term sustainment, he murmured. Not days, not weeks, decades, centuries, perhaps. Then why are they empty? I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to a symbol etched into the corner of the pods in a frame, a small skull with an Omega rune carved beneath it. An Omega seal, a final mark sanctum. Whoever was meant to sleep here, he whispered, never made it. The thought unsettled me more than the thing outside the door. A sanctum built for hundreds, left unused. For centuries, or longer. Talon found the cogitator core still functioning enough to display faded schematics. Though most files were corrupted, their runes shimmering with static. One single string of text, half buried in the data soup, caught our attention. Automated oversight protocol, active underneath it. Biological preservation priority. High and beneath that, authorized occupants. 0217th, Karen squinted at the screen. 0 occupants? 0 registered occupants, Talon corrected. The sanctum doesn't know we're here. It thinks it's empty. Good, Yoni muttered. I'd rather not be counted. But the old man shook his head. If the sanctum does not know we are here, then why? Why does it provide water? We all froze, because he was right. The water still flowed. The fungal lights still glowed. The ventilation was active. The cogitator was awake. That meant the sanctum hadn't merely survived the hive's collapse. It had been operating, maintaining, preparing. For what? For us? Or for someone else? Before we could answer, a soft chimming sound echoed through the sanctum, a tone so gentle it felt utterly alien in the apocalypse. Then a voice spoke, a voice that made every hair on my body rise. Calm, soft, mechanically perfect. Occupant presence detected. Talon turned instantly to the cogitator. Identify source. Biosignature cluster detected, the sanctum voice replied. Unregistered life forms present. Karen swore. Yoni backed away from the cogitator. The old man clutched his icon like it was a lifeline. Identify life forms, Talon commanded. A long pause. Then the voice said something I will never forget. Classification human. Relief washed through the sanctum brief, shaky, almost laughable. But it froze in our throats as the voice continued. Secondary life form detected. The word life form struck like a blade. Identify secondary life form, Talon said sharply. The cogitator screen flickered, static, a glitch. Then, slowly, runes appeared, unknown, mobile, approaching. The sanctum lights flickered. A distant thud echoed through the stone far away, but getting closer. The thing in the tunnels, Yoni whispered. It followed us here. How? Karen rasped. How could it track us through sealed rockreet? The old man answered softly. Some creatures do not follow scent. They follow heat, or movement, or breath. I swallowed hard, because the sanctum had been silent for centuries. No heat, no breath, no motion. Until we arrived. We had woken it. We had lit it up like a beacon in the deep. And now something hungry was coming to see what had disturbed its dark. We barricade, Talon said immediately, scanning the room. Pods, tools, anything. We heard it before we felt it, that dragging, wet lunged breath seeping through the rock like damp through cloth. A slow inhalation that wasn't just air filling something's chest, but the sound of the dark itself, being drawn inward. And every instinct I had, from the hive-raised fear of some monsters to the faith-hungry terror of the war pros together in a single, wordless command. Do not move. But hearts don't listen to orders, they just hammer harder. And mine was loud enough that I was sure whatever hunted outside could hear it, could taste it, could count the beats until it reached us. The sanctum itself seemed to react, its dim amber lights guttering, its ancient cogitator stuttering in its soft chant, the fungal glows in the corner dimming as if some invisible pressure pushed against them. And for a moment I could almost believe the bunker was alive, that it knew death had come scratching at its door again for the first time in centuries. The first impact on the outer rockreat wasn't a straight blow. It was a testing scrape, a long, slow drag of claws or something claw-like across the wall adjacent to the door, a sound that made my teeth ache and my jaw clench until it hurt, followed by a second, heavier touch that made dust sift down from the unseen seams of the ceiling, like the entire sanctum was being weighed in a hand too big to understand its shape. Yoni had the lascan trained on the door, even though we all knew if that ceiling failed, a single lost beam would be about as useful as a prayer whispered into a void. Keren's grip on his makeshift pipe weapon was so tight the metal creaked. The old man's lips moved in silent litany, eyes clenched shut. I compressed against his forehead so hard it left a red imprint in the shape of the aquila. Talon stood a step ahead of us all, shoulders squared. Not because she thought she could stop whatever came through, but because leadership in the Imperium sometimes means being the first to die where others can see you do it. The thing outside inhaled again, closer now, and this time when it exhaled, I could feel it, an invisible pressure pressing through the rock, a faint chill licking along the floor like fog under a door. With it came a smell, so subtle I couldn't be sure it was real, something like wet stone and rust and the stale sweetness of meat that hadn't decided whether to rot or grow. It stroked the edges of my thoughts like cold fingers and left behind a shiver I couldn't shake. For a heartbeat, the place where my skin met the icon in my pocket burned hot, a sharp contrast to the chill seeping under the door. And the sanctum's cogitator chimed again, a soft, almost apologetic tone before its calm, mechanical voice whispered into the silence. External anomaly detected. Structural integrity stable. Threat classification unknown. Defensive protocols limited. Of course, no guns. No blessed anti-demon wards. No void shield. Just old rock, old doors, old intention. Torland's jaw flexed. Define limited, she said, voice low but sharp. Explain defensive protocols. The cogitator hesitated, as if it needed to remember how to answer. Environmental modulation available, it said at last. Localized pressure discharge. Temperature variance. Gas distribution systems offline. External automated sentry systems unresponsive. Pressure discharge? Karen hissed. You mean it can what? Slammed the corridor with a shockwave. Probability greater than 80%, the machine replied. Another scrape along the door, harder this time, metal singing under stress. The sanctum's frame vibrated, ancient welds groaning in protest. Yoni swallowed audibly. Then do it, Talon snapped. Whatever you can do to that corridor, do it now. A low hum shivered through the floor, vibrating up through my boots into my bones, like the sanctum was taking a breath of its own. For a second the air pressure in the room changed. Ears popping, lungs compressing. Then there was a deep, thudding thum from beyond the door. Not the impact of something hitting us, but the echo of something slamming outward, as if the space right outside the sanctum had suddenly tried to expand, and then snapped back into place. The walls rattled. The fungi flared bright and then dimmed. The cogitator flickered. And then came a sound from the tunnels that I will hear for the rest of however long. I managed to keep drawing breath as strangled. Furious shriek, not quite animal, not quite mechanical, not entirely real. A sound with edges that scraped along the inside of the skull, carving their way through memory and panic alike. followed by the unmistakable crash of something enormous slamming against the far corridor wall, dislodging tons of stone and metal in a cascade of grinding, collapsing ruin. We all stumbled, knocked sideways as the floor juddered. Somewhere behind me, one of the pods toppled over with a hollow clang. Dust billowed down in thick sheets, choking our lungs, turning the amber light into hazy halos. Underneath it all, I could still hear that thing screaming, the pitch rising, warping, splintering into a dozen overlapping voices before cutting out with a crack. That felt like it snapped the tension in the room in half. Silence fell again, but it was different, emptier, less full of teeth. The cogitator's voice returned, its calm unsettling now. External passage compromise, significant. Unknown entity, no longer in close proximity. Probability of obstruction in primary pursuit tunnel. Hi, you mean we buried it? Karen said. Coughing dust. Or just pissed it off from a distance, Yoni muttered. Or both, I said, because the thought of that thing being crushed under tons of rock felt only slightly less terrifying than the idea of it wriggling free, angrier than before. Talon wiped dust from her face, eyes hard. Doesn't matter. We gained time. That's all anything has ever given us. The old man sank onto one of the benches lining the sanctum wall, breathing hard, hands shaking. The Emperor guarded these walls, he rasped. He turned the machine's hand against the darkness. I wanted to believe him. Emperor knows I did. But as I looked around the sanctum, the still functioning water basin, the humming pipes, the oddly responsive cogitator, I couldn't shake the feeling that if any will lingered in this place, it wasn't purely divine. It was human, or something near enough that the difference didn't matter, the will of whoever built this bunker, and then never used it, of tech priests who had carved it into the hive like a last chance thought, and forgotten to tell anyone it existed. Their intention lived on here, encoded in circuits and seals, and for now, it had aligned with our desire to live. For now, with the immediate threat pushed back into the stone, the sanctum's quiet returned thick, layered, full of old breaths and older waiting. The adrenaline that had kept our bodies braced for impact drained all at once, leaving a bone-deep fatigue behind. We moved like sleepwalkers, rearranging the barricade into something more stable, checking for cracks in the doorframe, making sure the fungi garden's glow wasn't flickering out. The water still dripped steadily into the basin, its sound maddeningly gentle under the memory of that creature's scream. It felt obscene to drink, but thirst was a tyrant and we were its loyal subjects. We cupped our hands, took slow, careful sips, water tasting of metal and stone and some faint mineral sweetness that made my teeth ache. It was the best thing I'd ever tasted. It hurt to swallow. Hunger followed close behind, but for the first time since we fled the upper hive. It wasn't the loudest voice in the room. Fear had claimed that role. Fear, and something new creeping in around its edges, the awareness that our world had shrunk to this bunker and what lay just beyond it nothing more than a few meters of rockreet, a crushed tunnel and whatever else prowled the deep rails, driven from the light by the angels above. How long can this place sustain us? Yoni asked eventually, perched on the edge of a pod like a restless bird. Water, air, whatever these fungus things are feeding on. How long before the machine spirits tire of us? Talon consulted the flickering cogitator display, scrolling through corrupted data streams until she coaxed something readable from its depths. Primary life support systems routed through geothermal conduits, she read slowly. Redundant air scrubbers still at partial function. Nutrient synthesis arrays. Offline. She frowned. What arrays? Food, Karen said, rubbing a smear of dust between his fingers. There were supposed to be autofeeders down here, or at least gene vats. Something to keep 200 people from eating each other, while whatever killed the surface burned out. He looked around the room at the empty pods, at the unclaimed benches. Looks like no one showed up for their turn in the tomb. Maybe they never got the order. Yoni suggested. Maybe whatever hit the hive was too fast. The old man shook his head, eyes fixed on some point only he could see. Or maybe someone decided we weren't worth saving. He said quietly, not this hive, not this world, not this time. His words sat in the air like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through all our thoughts, because that was the truth we'd all grown up with but never said so plainly. In the ledger of the Imperium, some worlds were worth fleets and chapters and miracles. Others were just numbers, sacrifice tallies, footnotes. Our sky had broken, the angels had descended. The dreadnoughts had woken, and not once had anyone broadcast a message telling us where to go, how to live, what to save. We were, at best, collateral in a war being fought over our heads. At worst, we were contagion, a liability to be erased. The cogitator chimed again then, as if offended at our inattention. External Vox signal detected, it announced. Sleep became an illusion in the hours after the exterminatus broadcast, a word that felt too small for the kind of stunned paralysis that kept us suspended between breaths, between thoughts, between the cold weight of reality and the stubborn, irrational pulse of our bodies refusing to surrender. And in that limbo the sanctum felt different than before, colder, tighter, as though it too had heard the sentence passed on our world and shrank around us in quiet dread. The lights dimmed without flickering. The water seemed to drip slower, the air tasted heavier, and every breath carried the awareness that somewhere above, ships the size of cities were aligning to end us with the same clinical detachment one uses to snuff out a lantern. But life, even the kind dragging itself through fear like a wounded animal, always demands movement. And eventually Talon was the one who forced us upright. Her voice hoarse but steady as she told us we needed to take inventory of what we had left. How long the sanctum could sustain us. Whether there was any chance of finding an exit through the auxiliary tunnels. Before the firestorm reached the lower hive, Karen argued that running from orbit to surface bombardment was madness. Yoni whispered that even if we escaped the hive, the wastelands outside would kill us slower, but just as surely. Yet Talon folded their fears into her focus the way she always did, absorbing the blows and staying upright. We can't control the sky, she said quietly, but we can control where we stand when it falls. And that single stubborn sentence carried us into motion again, because pettier hopes had carried us through worse. We spread out into the sanctum, exploring corners we had been too afraid to touch before. Prying open storage vaults, peeling back old panels caked in dust thick as velvet. I followed the old man to the bioluminescent fungi garden, watching the faint green glow ripple across the curved walls. He ran his fingers lightly over the soft caps, murmuring that they reminded him of the glow shrines his mother used to keep in the hat block. Little patches of engineered moss that flickered with false starlight to help workers remember what the sky must have been like once. He plucked a small cluster, crushed it between his fingertips and inhaled. Still living, he whispered, a strange reverence in his voice. Still growing. Even in this forgotten place, something about that image of fragile, glowing life refusing entropy in the dark unsettled me more than corpses or monsters, or angels ever had. Because if life could persist here for centuries without witnesses, then maybe we weren't as alone as we thought. Maybe the hive had whole ecosystems of the forgotten, whole layers of misplaced life the Imperium would never count in its ledgers. If it survived, I asked quietly, why shouldn't we? The old man smiled without looking at me, his eyes fixed on the softly glowing basin. Because life does not fear the dark, he said, but men fear everything they cannot see. Before I could answer, the cogitator chimed again, 3 measured tones this time. Not the soft alert from before, but something deeper, older, as if it were clearing its throat after centuries of silence. Talon reached it first, wiping dust from the display with her sleeve. Runes flickered, rearranged, stabilizing into something intelligible. Sector pressure variance detected. Then, upper hive structural failure, cascading. It listed coordinates we couldn't interpret. Then another line, projected collapse trajectory, descending. Karen's face blanched. The hive's falling on us, he whispered. Not fire, not bombardment. The entire upper structure is collapsing downward. That's what happens when the angel's fire melters into primary support beams, Yoni muttered. But her voice trembled. They're trying to contain the infection, not preserve the hive. Another line blinked onto the display. Almost lazily, Estimated impact in lower substructures, 3-5 hours. Silence knifed through us. Even the water seemed to drip slower. The old man sagged against the fungi wall and whispered a prayer so soft it barely existed. Exterminatus above, collapse below. A monster in the tunnels that had not been killed, only delayed. And us caught between all three like insects trapped under a turning boot. We can't stay, Talon said, her voice unusually hollow. If the hive comes down, the sanctum won't hold. Karen gestured wildly. And leave to where? Back to the tunnels? Back to that thing? We can't outrun orbital fire, Yoni said. We can't outrun a collapsing hive. We can't outrun a monster we can't even see. So what exactly are we running toward? Talon looked at the sanctum door, the thick slab of reinforced rockreet that had saved us once. Maybe twice, and her eyes hardened in that way they got, when she committed to something she knew would hurt. Not toward anything, she said, through. We didn't understand. Not until she knelt beside one of the half-functioning survival pods, and pried off a panel with her knife. Beneath it, embedded deep in the sanctum's floor and wall, was a conduit thick, insulated, humming faintly with the same pulse as the cogitator. She followed it with a hand to a seam behind the water basin, brushed away dust, and revealed a latch, a hidden panel, a hidden door, behind it a vertical shaft, narrow, ancient, almost womb-like in its curvature, lined with metal rungs and a faint, warm updraft of air that smelled not of rot or rust or chemical waste, but of something startlingly clean, geothermal heat. This sanctum was built for long-term habitation, Talon murmured, and for evacuation, but not up. She looked at us, eyes fierce, almost fever-bright. Down? Karen recoiled. Down where? There's nothing down there but bedrock and broken machines and things we don't have names for. Yoni swallowed. She's right. Below this? I think it drops into the hive's thermal grid. I stared into the shaft, watching the darkness breathe, feeling the warm pulse of air rise in slow intervals. It was like staring into the throat of some slumbering titan. You want us to climb into that? Karen demanded. That or die here, Talon said simply. Another seismic shudder rumbled through the sanctum, stronger than before. A small crack skittered across the ceiling, dust falling like grey snow. The hive was groaning, dying, folding into itself. Above it all, in the unseen heavens, ships were waiting to finish the job. Talon looked at each of us, her voice steady. We survived the upper hive by going down. We survived the rails by going down. We survived the tunnels by going down. Every time the world above tried to kill us, we found life below it. And this time, I asked. Her jaw tightened. This time we go down far enough that even the fire struggles to reach us. Karen cursed. Yoni trembled. The old man touched the edge of the shaft with reverence, whispering something about the Emperor guiding his lost children into his buried hearth. I didn't know if the Emperor guided anything anymore, but the warm air rising from the depths wasn't a lie. It wasn't death. It wasn't fire or monsters or collapsing steel. It was possibility. Terrifying, insane, but possibility. Another tremor rocked the sanctum. The fungal garden quivered, shedding spores. A distant, grinding roar trembled through the stone, the monster in the tunnels moving again. Maybe drawn by the shifting earth, maybe by us, maybe just by hunger. There was no time left. Talon slung her pack across her back, grabbed a rung, and pulled herself into the shaft. We climb, she said. Now. Yoni went next, breathing hard but steady. The old man followed, slow but determined. I hesitated only long enough to meet Karen's eyes, hopeless, furious, terrified. If we stay, I whispered, we die under someone else's decision. That broke him. He grabbed the rung. I followed last. The sanctum lights dimmed behind me as I descended into the warm dark, the cogitator humming softly in a way that reminded me of a lullaby, old and tired and resigned. Just before the panel closed above us, sealing off the sanctum forever, I looked back one last time, and in that final sliver of amber light, I thought I saw something move in the far corner of the bunker, something small and quick retreating into a crack in the wall. Another survivor, another creature, a shadow pretending to be alive. I never got the answer. The panel slid shut. Darkness swallowed us, and for the second time since the sky broke, I felt the hive shift above me not slowly, not groaning, but collapsing in a long, shuddering exhale as though releasing the last breath of a dying world. We climbed downward, toward heat, toward uncertainty, toward the only direction left, and above us, a planet waited to burn.